Number 15. Snake on a plane. Samuel L. Jackson would have lost his mind on this Aeromexico flight. A real-life snake on a plane started slithering down from the overhead compartment. The scary viper was alive and well and interested in visiting the cabin passengers. Two of the passengers on board reportedly captured the snake using magazines and a blanket in preparation for landing. The airline is unsure how this snake boarded this plane, but for many frequent flyers on this flight, I'm sure this was their first time seeing something like this. Number 14. Terror of turbulence. When American Airlines Flight 280 took off from Seoul, South Korea, heading to Dallas, none of the 240 passengers aboard the flight knew they were about to take the scariest ride of their lives, but that's just what happened. The plane encountered severe turbulence, which was caught on camera by passengers. The turbulence was so severe that the flight was diverted to Tokyo. After 15 people aboard the flight were injured, 5 of them being hospitalized. One passenger, Mark Stanley, an attorney in Dallas, told the Morning News they were diverted after 45 plus minutes of insane turbulence. The remaining passengers were put up in Tokyo for the night, but not sure if I'd have the stomach to get back on a plane the next day. Number 13. The Eye of the Hurricane. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration aircraft took advantage of flying through Hurricane Irma to show us by taking this horrifying video of the storm outside. As the aircraft flew through the Atlantic Ocean's most powerful hurricane ever recorded, it gained vital information of the storm's path using drop sensors, as well as measuring the storm's intensities via radar readings. Irma made landfall in the Caribbean. Hurricane winds and rains whipped the airplane as it stood in the midst of Irma's power, but slowly the clouds lightened and the blue sky could be seen while the rain ceased. The contrast shows the magnitude and absolute power of a hurricane at full throttle. Number 12. Flight attendant meltdown. Constant requests from passengers, complaints for delays, no one listening or paying attention, and all other types of annoyances. Service jobs can be rough, and service jobs in high-flying planes can certainly be that much rougher. But there's no excuse really for this scary rant from an American Airlines flight attendant that prompted 3 passengers to call 911 for help. The flight attendant in question is said to have suffered a mental breakdown and was caught on video making threats over the intercom.
This has not happened to me since 9/11 and I'm not putting up with this! Somebody call 911, security system, I'm about to kill passengers before takeoff! Stop. I have been finally trained by the FAA.
One of the passengers who called 911 emergency dispatcher said they're talking over the radio about crashing our plane. One dispatcher attempted to clarify, "You're currently on board the flight, and the attendants are announcing over the PA system that they're going to crash the plane." Thankfully, American Airlines Flight 2332 was still grounded at Dallas and hadn't taken off yet. Some concerned passengers proceeded to detain the flight attendant after 911 dispatchers were able to put together what was happening. During the confused passenger phone calls, the flight was returned to the gate and the flight attendant was removed. Number 11. Small plane, stormy landings. When this small plane's propeller stopped moving, it was forced to emergency land. We're now experiencing engine failure, says the man videotaping the event. If there's a place to land, we shall be okay. He speaks rather calmly considering their propeller froze mid-air. The sky around the hilly region appears murky, and there's clearly some strong wind tearing at the aircraft. Find a flat ground so that rescue vehicles can come in, the man says. He places all responsibility on the pilot, telling him, "It all relies on your experience now." The pair find a piece of land in the water to force landing upon, and again he emphasizes how they're all relying on the captain. The plane quickly descends and hits the ground with a thud. They strike a rock, but the pair lives. When they rather calmly land, the man videoing the incident thanks the captain for saving his life. The captain says he told someone this plane wasn't good to go. Number 10. Please pray. When AirAsia flight D7237's engine began to malfunction, its pilot, Captain Ibrahim, asked passengers to pray.
Listen to the briefing. Our survival depends on your cooperating.
The AirAsia flight was later found to be missing a blade, causing the A330 to shake uneasily as it flew over Western Australia. The captain's announcements kept everyone calm. AirAsia CEO Tony Fernandez said he also claimed that the criticism garnered from the event was because AirAsia is a low-cost airline. The bad press seemed to be more about the fact that the pilot had asked passengers to pray rather than the malfunctioning of the engine. Most critics said admitting fear to the passengers was not a great tactic. Sounds like the captain should attend a course in how to calm passengers. One online critic wrote, "Prompting them to pray is obviously not the best idea." Number 9. Don't worry, just a few panels missing. When a pilot gets on the intercom and apologizes for this absolute mess, the last thing you want to find looking out your window is a crane seemingly air drying your aircraft's wings. The aircraft you're about to take off into the sky on. The pilot of this flight went on to say that their delay was due to mechanical problems, those problems being panels missing on the outside body of the airplane. Yeah, don't worry, the body of your aircraft was not intact only a few moments ago.
And do sincerely apologize for this absolute mess we're encountering this morning. They had some panels loose and missing on our airplane outside of the...
The pilot then detailed how and why the mechanical problems took so much time to fix, noting that they didn't have the proper tools and/or panels to replace the missing bits and pieces of the plane's body, so they had to get engineering approval from the manufacturers to use alternative panels. The very verbose pilot then goes on to tell the bemused passengers that, while they were waiting for approval, they were provided a new aircraft. But wait, there's more. The aircraft they were given also had mechanical issues with its landing gear, accounting for an even longer delay, which leads us to this painful flight announcement from the pilot.
However, the airplane, what we didn't know was that the airplane arrived with the mechanical issues as well, and that one was apparently due to the landing gear issues, which obviously is not safe to fly the airplane.
Unfortunately, the video cuts out before the pilot announces which they decided to use, but it's safe to assume the flight reached its destination without any further incident, as one of the passengers was able to upload this video to YouTube. Number 8. Plane panel cracks mid-flight. You expect a bad passenger experience every now and then. You expect turbulence, but you don't expect the body of the plane to crack mid-flight. That's what happened on an American Airlines flight headed from San Francisco to Dallas in 2014. As the body of the plane began to visibly crack open, passengers started screaming for flight attendants. They alerted the crew to the fact that the interior panel of the cabin on both sides had started to pull away from the walls, leaving a gap. The captain considered continuing on to Dallas because the plane's cabin pressure held steady. Then the plane also started to shake violently. After inspection, the captain called into air traffic control for an emergency landing. Horrified passengers started taking video of the event, some of which was uploaded to YouTube and sent to local news channels. One of the passengers, James Wilson, said that popping noises were heard outside of the cabin not long after the flight took off and the fuselage began to shake. The insulation was exposed as the interior panels pulled from the walls and the cabin pressure dropped. An American Airlines spokesperson said that the cause was a blown air duct, which would be investigated. The passenger, James Wilson, said it was the whole row 14 on all sides, from the floor to the ceiling. All of a sudden we heard this loud pop, pop, pop. Really loud in this ripping sound. It sounded like bowling balls were falling from the overhead bins. Number 7. Unruly passengers. You don't want to cross paths with unruly flight attendants on your next flight, but neither do you want to run into unruly passengers. These can be equally scary and intimidating in an enclosed space that's set to take you hundreds of feet above the ground and away from emergency services. More than an hour after taking off from Minneapolis, 2 passengers had an in-flight meltdown on Delta Flight 2565 that was recorded by fellow passengers in this scary video caught on an airplane. The passengers were so unruly that the flight had to turn around and head back to Minneapolis. The couple in question were 35-year-old and 36-year-old Blake and Anna. Anna attempted to use the bathroom not long after takeoff. Doing so isn't allowed, and the flight attendant told her to go back to her seat. Both passengers then went nuts. Once Blake entered the shouting match, at least one other passenger came to the flight attendant's aid. When the plane grounded back in Minneapolis, police arrived to haul the obnoxious pair off. To the cheers of their fellow passengers, they were charged with disorderly conduct. Delta put out the following statement about the incident. The flight crew of Delta 2565 from Minneapolis-St. Paul to Los Angeles elected to return to Minneapolis shortly after takeoff when 2 passengers refused to follow crew instructions, became aggressive, and created a disruption in the cabin. Number 6. The Hudson. If you've ever wondered about whether or not planes run into birds as they pierce through the sky, US Airways Flight 1549 responded with a definitive, yes they do. In fact, on January 15, 2009, when this giant Airbus A320-214 took off from New York City's LaGuardia Airport and flew right into an entire flock of Canadian geese, the big birds almost took out the giant bird in the sky. The collision caused the plane to lose engine power completely, and as this occurred over the George Washington Bridge, they were not near enough to an airport to land safely. Instead, pilots Sullenberger and Skiles were forced to do the unimaginable and land their plane on the Hudson River. 57-year-old Sully Sullenberger was the commanding pilot, having logged nearly 20,000 flight hours and having served as a fighter pilot in the US Air Force in 1980. He's also considered an aviation safety expert. When the plane struck the geese, the pilot saw nothing but big birds, and the crew and passengers heard the collision and saw flames strike up from the engines. Sully noted that both engines were down, and Skiles started running down the engine restart checklist. As the aircraft climbed a bit but then slowly began to descend, Mayday was radioed in, and Sully originally said they'd be turning back to LaGuardia, but after realizing he wouldn't be able to make it, he considered attempting landing at Teterboro Airport. Again, he realized they wouldn't make it there either, so he radioed to say, "We can't do it, we're gonna be in the Hudson." Passing only 900 feet over the George Washington Bridge, Sully told everyone on board to brace for impact, and the Coast Guard was told by air traffic controllers to clear the Hudson and get ready to assist with a grand rescue. This incident could have been disastrous. Instead, it ended with 155 passengers surviving, only some with minor injuries, and all rescued by boats nearby. Can't say the same about the flock of geese, but at least the passengers made it out alive. The National Transportation Safety Board called it the most successful ditching in aviation history, and it's also been called the Miracle on the Hudson. Number 5. Emergency landing. After a malfunctioning fan started to disrupt a Cathay Pacific flight, the captain was forced to make an emergency landing, and the whole scary event was caught on camera by 25-year-old passenger Ethan Williams.
Okay, so we've just had an announcement. We've got an emergency landing. We don't know what's going on, but we've told we've got an emergency landing.
Williams started taking video on his cell phone during the scary rundown by flight attendants on what to do if they were forced to ditch in the sea. Flight CX-884 was heading from Hong Kong to Los Angeles when a cooling fan began to smoke. The pilot then turned to Alaska's islands to land at a remote military airport. Williams told ABC News, "We were getting told you had to take your shoes off and leave everything behind, and what we needed to do and where our nearest exits were going to be, and making sure we had our jackets on properly." Thankfully, none of the 18 crew members or 276 passengers were forced to use this emergency information as the Boeing 777-300ER landed safely on Shemya Island. The passengers didn't even deboard the plane. Instead, they stayed seated, watching movies. As the emergency cooling fan was repaired, the plane flew shortly to Anchorage, where passengers were replaned on another Cathay Pacific Air vehicle, and then flew on to Los Angeles, where it landed safely. While this episode of scary plane malfunctions had a happy ending, the experience was nothing short of terrifying. Number 4. Police storm flight for hoax threat. As with many forms of mass transportation these days, bomb threats are the #1 concern. That's why when a 25-year-old man allegedly made a bomb threat on a Sunwing flight that was headed to Panama from Toronto in 2014, it was taken absolutely seriously. The dramatic footage of heavily armed police storming the flight was caught by another passenger on board, but the suspect's father said he was not at fault and had severe mental health issues, including anorexia, bulimia, and depression. He claimed his son had never received support for these issues. Ali allegedly said he wanted to bomb not just the plane but all of Canada. This was after he was handed a headset by the flight attendant, prompting him to say he hated Canada. The cigarettes were too expensive, and therefore he wanted to bomb it. The pilot turned the plane around 45 minutes into the flight, and Sunwing Flight 772 was escorted back to Toronto Pearson International Airport by 2 U.S. fighter jets as a precautionary measure. Police met the flight on the ground, surrounded the airliner, and officers boarded yelling, "Heads down, hands up." One passenger, Lorena Kareem, described the SWAT team storming the plane. "I was in the washroom, and when I was trying to come out, the SWAT team shut the door on me, and I was there for what seemed like an eternity, and all I saw was guns. It was quite scary." Some have said the police response was overly aggressive, and passengers have called it extremely frightening. Police charged Ali Shahai with uttering threats, endangering aircraft safety, mischief interfering with lawful enjoyment of property, and mischief to property. And unfortunately for those aboard the Sunwing flight, their second flight went barely any better, as it was diverted yet again to Montego Bay, Jamaica, when a medical emergency occurred on board. Incredibly unlucky plane journey for these folks. Number 3. The arrest. Yet another belligerent passenger brought police to this Virgin Atlantic flight. The passenger was allegedly under the influence when he began yelling at flight attendants who refused to serve him anymore. The flight was headed from London to Montego Bay, Jamaica, when it was forced to make an emergency landing after the disturbed passenger became uncontrollable.
He's gonna get burned.
The whole incident was caught on video by a fellow passenger, Ola Lily. The video shows the passenger shouting at a male flight attendant and moving towards him aggressively. While the attendant appears to be trying to settle the situation, a female passenger intervenes, asking the passenger, "Are you mad?" To which he throws a piece of clothing in her direction. The man was removed from the plane by police and arrested in Bermuda. During the arrest, he refused to get up, so more officers had to board to force him off the airliner. Passengers said they received an apology letter from Virgin Atlantic after the flight, although I'm sure more passengers are still waiting on an apology from the man himself. Number 2, a landing nearly gone horrible. This landing was caught on video in 2008 in Hamburg, Germany. A federal bureau then looked into the scary incident and released their findings in 2010. According to their investigation, here's what happened.
Whoa.
132 passengers were aboard this flight. The Airbus A320 was attempting to land in a storm with strong wind gusts, but when the aircraft touched down, the wind took it to one side and a wing scraped on the runway, which forced the pilot to abort the landing and again ascend. But while at first glance, it seemed the weather was the chief cause, the investigation found the issues with the aircraft were deeper than that. Standard Airbus documentation did not describe how pilots should respond and should expect their plane to respond in such conditions. The Airbus computer also switched to ground mode as it descended to land, which limits the pilot's power as the flight computer takes over. In short, the pilots were not able to provide the necessary force in countersteering against the crosswind of the storm, which allowed for the wingtip to hit the runway. It was only by ascending that the pilot was able to take full control of the plane again. The A320's flight manual was also criticized for being unclear. The maximum crosswind demonstrated for landing for the A320 was less than the 47 knots that were reported by the tower that day, but the manual instructions provided conflicting information on how to proceed. 80 pilots were interviewed afterwards, and many interpreted the instructions differently. The agency advised Lufthansa and Airbus to revise their flight documentation and improve their flight's computers after this incident. Nothing like a horrifying experience to make some changes in protocol. Before we get to number 1, my name is Chills and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you're curious about what I look like in real life, then go to my Instagram at DylanIsChillinYT and tap that follow button to find out. I'm currently doing a super poll on my Instagram. If you believe ghosts are real, then go to my most recent photo and tap the like button. If you don't, DM me saying why. When you're done, come right back to this video to find out the number 1 entry. Also, follow me on Twitter at YTChills because that's where I post video updates. It's a proven fact that generosity makes you a happier person. So if you're generous enough to hit that subscribe button and the bell beside it, then thank you. This way you'll be notified of the new videos we upload every Tuesday and Saturday. Number 1, pilot has a meltdown mid-air. You somewhat expect breakdowns from passengers and flight attendants here and there, but a pilot meltdown has got to be the scariest thing you'd ever experience on a flight. In 2012, a number of passengers did experience it when a 47-year-old JetBlue pilot and 12-year-old veteran, Osbon, suddenly began to rant and rave mid-flight.
We got Iraq! We're gonna get down! I feel like it!
During a flight from New York to Las Vegas, he came out of the bathroom telling passengers to say your prayers, and claiming the plane was going down. He then began to rant about Iraq, Iran, 9/11, Sin City and Jesus, shouting incoherently from the cockpit. "Guys, push it to full throttle," he allegedly screamed. The rant had begun in the cockpit, startling his co-pilot. As Osbon started to speak incoherently about religion, he also told him things just don't matter and began shouting at air traffic control to be quiet, after which he started flicking the controls at random and saying they weren't going to Vegas while listing numbers that weren't relevant or related. This was when the co-pilot suggested bringing in another JetBlue pilot who was on board. Osbon then went to sit in the cabin, where he began disrupting the passengers and the flight attendants and attempting to break back into the cockpit. Thankfully, the pilot had alerted the security codes and radioed for ground assistance. Osbon then went crazy, racing up and down the aisle and shouting disjointed thoughts. Those on board were obviously frightened from this scary meltdown, and 4 passengers confronted the pilot, including a retired NYPD sergeant, trying to calm him down and restrain him. The pilot is said to have had a mental breakdown and was taken to the hospital. He was charged with interfering with a flight crew and suspended, which carries a max of 20 years in prison. Talk about a hard day at work. Thanks for checking out this video. Be sure to subscribe because we upload new countdowns every Tuesday and Saturday. Or if you're still not convinced, here are some of our other videos that I think you'd like. Enjoy!